Welcome to part 2 of analyzing the 2020 anti-racism protests. This part is going to discuss outside agitators. And outside agitators have been a common narrative, a common point of discussion in the media and among elected officials. So let's start with a simple question, right? Who is an outside agitator? So first, they are not part of the group making demands, right? So they are an outsider. And we can think of outsider in two ways, right? Spatial relations. They are from somewhere else coming here to make trouble, right? They're not from this town or this city, they're from another town or another city. But also group relations, right? They are some other. They are not part of the social movement advocating for dismantling systemic racism. They have some other agenda. They don't agree with the tactics or the demands that the group is making. Second, they are an agitator, right? They are responsible for violence or excessive demands. And the story often goes something like this, right? People were protesting peacefully, residents get along with the state, but these outsiders, they come in and they rile up all of these racial tensions and they cause violence and destruction. And if there weren't these outside agitators, we wouldn't see violence, we wouldn't even see protests. So the first thing I can say is beware the outside agitator dog whistle. This is a tactic that police and governments use systematically in the US and other countries to try and dismiss or discredit protest movements. It's a common tactic, especially when dealing with anti-racism protests here in the US. So for example, Martin Luther King Jr. during the civil rights era was labeled an outside agitator. So here are two examples of the outside agitator narrative being used incorrectly. So when protests first break out in Minneapolis over the death of George Floyd, Governor Tim Walz and the media are quick to blame outside agitators, right? On the 5th day of continuous protests, a lot of these we're seeing a lot of violence. The governor goes so far as to say, this is no longer about George Floyd. This is about criminals from the outside coming in and stirring up all this trouble, and everything was fine before that. And police arrest a ton of people, and the media is quick to jump on the story that these are outsiders who came from somewhere else to start trouble. Well, later media reports sort of clarify that most of the protesters that were arrested were actually from Minneapolis. These are local people. They were very angry. This was about George Floyd. It was also about police brutality and other systemic racist issues that they were facing. Second example, June 2020, NYPD claimed that violent outside agitators had infiltrated a protest in the Bronx, that these agitators had guns and gasolines and weapons and were going to essentially create some sort of domestic terror that destroyed property and cost a ton of lives, right? Scary stuff. So they go in, they use force to crush and arrest the protests. Problem is, after this ends, right, there's no evidence that any of that was true. The police provide no evidence of guns or gasoline or weapons. And actually what we know from video on the scene and media reporting is that the protests were actually peaceful. And the police come in and just crush a peaceful demonstration with overwhelming force, right? This is using violence against peaceful protesters. In the United States, you have the right to peaceful assembly under the First Amendment. And so we should always be a little weary. So what cause does this serve? Right? Why would a government talk about outside agitators? Well, one reason is that if you can frame a protest as being committed by outside agitators, the public is less likely to punish you as an elected official or to look negatively on the police if they go in and use violence against those outside agitators. Similarly, if you can frame the protests as violent, police and elected officials are punished less if they go in and violently crush a violent protest. But if these are locals, if they're engaging in non-violent behavior, and police use violence against them, the public tends to side with the protesters. So support for the protests go up. So this is one tactic that governments and police use to try and shape the narrative about whether protests are violent or peaceful. If they're successful at framing this as outside agitator, then they can go in and repress protesters and undermine your right to peaceful assembly. So what about when there are outside agitators? Well, the first set of outside agitators that is discussed in the media are white supremacists. Proud Boys, Europa, Aryan Cowboys, the KKK, etc. Right? And the first good example we have of this is in Minneapolis. There are a bunch of videos of the Umbrella Man, a guy in a gas mask and an umbrella, walking around and smashing windows. And people at the protest are saying, he's not one of us, who is he? We've since then learned that he's a white supremacist who infiltrated the group to try and stir up violence and stir up racial tension. And so these groups have a variety of tactics that they use to accomplish their goal. Right? They want to maintain white supremacy and prevent any attempts at racial equality. One of which is to identify themselves as protesters or Antifa, and then use violence to undermine the movement and stoke racial tensions, right? So like I said before, if they can make it appear as if the protests are violent, then this serves as a justification for the police to come in and crush protests. Or it serves as justification for white supremacist groups to come in and protect communities, right? Certain communities, not others. Another example, right? We have an Antifa Twitter account called For Looting White Hoods, is actually run by the white nationalist group Europa. Another popular tactic that has been used is car ramming, right? Driving your car into a peaceful protest. It's an atrocious act. It's deadly, right? And this is becoming more common. So the image on the right, which is provided by ACLID and the Crisis Monitor, shows where these instances have occurred. And it's not just being carried out by individuals, it's being carried out by police officers, which should scare us. So the second group, Antifa, stands for Anti-Fascist. And unlike the white supremacist organizations, which are an actual organization, they have a hierarchical structure, they have resources, they have some mechanisms of accountability. Antifa is an idea or a movement. It doesn't make sense to talk about them in the same way that we talk about Europa or the Proud Boys. And the movement begins in the 1920s and 1930s. As fascism is rising around the world, especially in Germany, Italy, and Spain, some militant leftists use violence to try and combat fascism. Right, so this is the idea is sometimes you need to use violence to combat fascism and doctrines of racial supremacy. 1970s and 90s, this reemerges in the UK and Germany, specifically in the music scene, where people calling themselves Antifa are trying to remove neo-Nazi skinheads from music venues. So Antifa is not an organization, right? And attempts to label it as such, to label it a terrorist organization, are really attempts to say that there is violence on both sides, which isn't very accurate, right? The goal of Antifa is to combat white supremacist groups and fascist groups. And so arguably, people would not need to show up under the banner of Antifa if people were able to protest racial inequality peacefully. And a lot of the times Antifa shows up with the express goal of protecting protesters and protecting their right to protest. Right? They're not well organized, they do not have a central command structure or hierarchy, they don't have resources. You sort of show up and say, I am with the concept of Antifa. So you can criticize their tactics, you can criticize the use of violence, right? But when we're talking about equivalent violence on both sides, it's not a very good argument, right? White supremacists are well organized, they're armed, and they are actually causing a lot of harm. Okay, the third group, right? Police as agent provocateurs. Right, so some people have argued that police are infiltrating protest sites and leaving these pallets of bricks, hashtag bait bricks, so that protesters use them to smash windows and they can go in and then crush the protest. There's actually no evidence that this is true. This seems to be misinformation used to sort of stoke racial tensions. Police violence and the militarization of the police have led to escalations, right? So police behavior is responsible for escalating protests that otherwise would have remained peaceful into violent protests. And we'll talk about that in the fourth segment. But we should be careful not to analyze protester violence specifically without asking what the police are doing and what counter-protesters are doing. So the final category is crimes of opportunity, right? This is the argument that protesters are really just looting and rioting. And the word looting is race baiting, right? It is used to try and equate the protest with poor, Black, crime-ridden communities. Now, this narrative usually has sort of three layers to it, right? One is economic grievances. People are suffering, they're poor, they loot to feed their family. During the current pandemic, it might be reasonable to think that we should see some of this. Another is targeted violence against businesses seen as responsible. Usually when we have riots, violence is targeted at specific businesses that are predatory and have been preying on the community. And so this sort of retaliatory looting. And the final one is just, it's opportunistic crime that uses protests as cover. I think this is probably the best way to think about some of the looting we've seen. That is, the protests serve as a good distraction, crime is occurring, but it is not tied to the goals of the anti-racism movement, certainly not the Black Lives Matter movement. So what are some takeaways? White supremacists have infiltrated some of these protesters and engaged in violence. People under the ANTIFA banner have organized to combat white supremacists with violence. But outside agitators are rare. Discussing them is distracting from protester demands, given that we've seen, over 7,500 protests and outside agitators are a factor in a very, very, very small percentage of them. It's unclear why we are spending so much time discussing them. We'll talk about this in the next segment, but 93% of protests are peaceful. 90% of the places that have seen a protest have not experienced any violence. And violence where it does occur is limited to a block or two. So don't let the outside agitator narrative fool you. And when you hear police or elected officials talk about outside agitators, you should be skeptical because it is often used to try and distract. Okay, next segment is part 3. We're going to talk about violent and non-violent protests.